This is BBC One on Monday, the 19th of September. Now, the funeral of Her Majesty, the Queen.
For the first time in over 2.5 centuries, Westminster Abbey is the setting for a state funeral after the death of the longest reigning monarch in British history. Today in London and in Windsor, we close one of the most significant chapters in the remarkable story of the monarchy. On this 10th day of national mourning, following the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the doors of Westminster Abbey are about to be unlocked to admit the large congregation for today's state funeral. It will be a day of grief, of course, and a day of gratitude as well. And the events here in London and in Windsor will be on a truly majestic scale. The past 10 days have seen a mass public display of respect and admiration for the late Queen and the lifelong service that she gave throughout Britain, the Commonwealth, and beyond, as hundreds of thousands have made the pilgrimage to Westminster to pay their respects. All eyes on the Abbey and the doors open, ready for the congregation to arrive. And this state funeral will be attended by 2,000 guests, including heads of state, prime ministers, members of foreign royal families. The last monarch whose funeral was held at the Abbey, by the way, was George II, back in 1760. So this really is a day of history, as Britain says farewell to the monarch who broke all the records. Now, across the square at Westminster Hall, the Queen's lying in state formally ended a short while ago at 6:30 this morning. And the past 4 days, as we've seen, have seen queues stretching 5 miles along the south bank of the River Thames. But the opportunity to witness the scene in person, as I say, has now ended. And the next time we see the coffin, draped in the Royal Standard, it will be brought from the Palace of Westminster on the state gun carriage to Westminster Abbey for the service, which begins at 11 o'clock. And then following the service, the Queen's coffin will be drawn by more than 100 naval ratings in a long, majestic procession from the Abbey to Wellington Arch at London's Hyde Park corner. And there are more than 3,000 military personnel taking part in the procession. It's nearly 4,500 if you include all of those taking place at Windsor. And at Wellington Arch, the coffin will be transferred to the State Hearse for its final journey to the Queen's main home, which is Windsor Castle, where a procession will make its way up that glorious long walk and then into the castle precincts and down to St George's Chapel, where the Queen will be buried alongside her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. So, truly, there is a momentous day ahead, a day packed with glorious ceremony, glorious music, solemn worship, of course, at the Abbey, an experience that we will never forget. The state funeral of the longest reigning monarch in British history, a global event with many world leaders in attendance, and yet a very British event, an opportunity to say a last farewell to a much-loved sovereign. Now, the main ceremonial elements start just before the funeral service itself, as the Queen's coffin is taken from Westminster Hall to the Abbey on the state gun carriage of the Royal Navy. By the way, it's the carriage used for the funeral procession of the Queen's father, George VI, back in 1952. Senior members of the royal family, led by the King, will follow the gun carriage on foot. Now, the first procession, let's talk about that. It's the shorter of the two. It'll be led by the massed pipes and drums of the Scottish and Irish regiments, the Brigade of Gurkhas, the Royal Air Force. It will be a spectacular sight and sound. It will cross Parliament Square on its way to the Abbey, where the coffin will then be received by the Dean of Westminster and the Archbishop of Canterbury for the service. The second procession is much bigger. It's 1¼ miles long. It'll set off from the Abbey after the service at 12:15. It will involve thousands of military and civilian personnel, several military bands, members of the royal family and royal households. They will cross Parliament Square, go along Whitehall, past the Cenotaph there, past Downing Street, then turning left under the Horse Guards Arch, onto the expansive Horse Guards Parade, the scene of so many jubilant birthday parades for the Queen. And then the long procession will slowly make its way down along the Mall towards Buckingham Palace, past St James's Palace, past Clarence House, past Green Park on the right-hand side, around the memorial to Queen Victoria, past Buckingham Palace one final time, and then along Constitution Hill, heading for Hyde Park Corner, where there will be thousands of troops assembled at Wellington Arch. They'll be there by 1 o'clock, and the coffin will then be taken by hearse to Windsor. Now, here on BBC One, we have unrivalled coverage of the day's events, with some very special guests joining us along the way. If you'd like unaccompanied coverage, well, you can have that as well. You can use the service on the red button. So at this point in the morning, let's see how things are looking over at the Abbey, with just under 3 hours to the start of the service, and my colleague Fergal Keane is there.
The story of the monarchy, its most sublime hours and its most sorrowful, is embedded in the stone, wood and glass of this great building. Today it hosts the most significant state funeral of the modern age in Britain. A huge moment, not just in Britain, but for the many who will be watching across the world. It will be a funeral in which we will still feel the influence of the Queen, for she was deeply involved in planning the detail of this service. Members of the congregation began arriving in the Abbey a few moments ago. Here to mourn the death and honour the life of a monarch who'd always seemed to represent the best of their nation, the best of themselves. The tradition of royal funerals at the Abbey began with Edward the Confessor, buried here in 1066 on the site of the Abbey church he built. The first Queen Elizabeth, who died in 1603, is buried in the vault of the Abbey. And here too the grave of Richard II, calling to mind words that seem apt today of William Shakespeare from the play Richard II. Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. But we remember too that for Her Majesty this was also a place of joy, the place where her own marriage took place and her coronation, and from where she uttered these essential words: I have in sincerity pledged myself to your service, as so many of you are pledged to mine. Reflecting that bond between monarch and people, some 2,000 will attend the funeral from all walks of life. In line with that message of service, it will be a gathering together not simply of the powerful and the renowned, but of those distinguished by their gift of service. Members of the armed forces who risked their lives in war, dedicated community workers and members of the emergency services. All part of the fabric of community, woven from the selfless choices of individuals, and here to bid farewell to their Queen.
such a glorious setting. We'll be joining Fergal again in a short while. This morning's events here in London consist of that state funeral service and, as I said, the procession of thousands of personnel to accompany the Queen's coffin. And then the focus moves to Windsor and to the castle. David Dimbleby is there.
The castle at Windsor has a sombre air today. The skies are overcast, and it's here that the cortege will reform. Here, the Queen's home, the place she came to weekend after weekend, the place where she spent the years of the war, where she learnt to ride, where she put on pantomimes, a place, despite its grim appearance, that was actually her home. The cortege will reform here in a slightly different form, not quite as long as the procession in London, but with all the key elements there. The bands playing, the pipes and drums, the heralds, the pursuivants in their glorious tabards, members of the royal family, the royal household, the Queen's coffin borne on a state hearse with pallbearers and the escort party of the Grenadier Guards. And it will come up this long walk where people are already gathering, the people who've been here over the weekend laying flowers, which you can see on the left there on the way up to the castle entrance, the William IV gate, who are gathering, going through security, and by the time the procession arrives here, they'll be here in their thousands, I've no doubt. And through that gate the hearse goes, and beyond in the courtyard the King and members of the royal family who've travelled down from London will meet the hearse and accompany it down through the Norman Gate into the entrance of the chapel of St. George. This beautiful chapel, the coffin will be borne up through the west door and into the chapel itself. And there a service will take place which will have a different congregation, rather more intimate again. Godchildren will be there, people who've worked for the Queen. But there is at the centre of it one very special moment, the final moment before the burial, when the Queen's instruments of state, the crown, the orb, and the sceptre which travel on her coffin, will be placed on these 3 cushions on the high altar, removed from her coffin, given back after the 70 years of her reign, and then she herself will be laid to rest beside her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, and it has to be said 10 other British monarchs.
When the Queen's death was announced from Balmoral on September the 8th, a few days after Her Majesty had given that audience to the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, there was a great sense of uncertainty, of things being in flux, the loss of the nation's rock or anchor, as one member of the public put it in the queue in recent days. The truth is, of course, that the Queen represented continuity and certainty to millions of people, certainly across Britain, but throughout the Commonwealth as well. And the past 10 days have underlined that, as well as the big supply of goodwill that clearly exists towards the new King. This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Queen Elizabeth was a life well lived, a promise with destiny kept, and she is mourned most deeply in her passing. That promise of lifelong service I renew to you all today.